On Mother's Day, my millionaire son asked, "Mom, are you happy with the $500 I send?" I said nothing. He didn't know I had seen his bank statement, $80,000 a month on his mistress. When his wife entered the room, I took out my phone and showed her. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Dorothy Callahan, and I was 71 years old when my son looked me in the eye and asked me if $500 a month was enough to make me happy. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest. I was not a bitter woman. I was not a suspicious mother who read dark meanings into everything her child said. I raised Richard alone after his father, Gerald, passed from a heart attack in 1998. Rich was only 17 then. I worked double shifts at the hospital where I was a medical records clerk for 22 years. I skipped vacations. I bought my clothes at Goodwill. I made sure that boy had everything he needed to become what he became, and he became a lot. By the time he was 45, Richard ran a mid-sized wealth management firm in Columbus with 31 employees and clients whose names occasionally appeared in local business journals. He drove a black Audi. He owned a house in Dublin, Ohio, the kind of neighborhood with stone mailboxes and invisible fences. His wife, Elena, was a pediatrician, quiet and kind, the sort of woman who remembered your birthday without Facebook reminding her. They had 2 children, Marcus, 14, and Lily, 11. I lived 40 minutes away in the same house where I'd raised Rich. 3 bedrooms, a leaky gutter I kept meaning to fix, a vegetable garden in the back that Gerald had started and I'd never stopped tending. Rich had offered to buy me something newer, something in a better part of town. I said no. I said this house had my husband's hands in the walls, and I wasn't ready to leave that. He nodded and reduced my monthly transfer to $500. That's not entirely fair. He had been sending me money since he turned 30, first $300, then $500. It was never discussed as an obligation. It arrived quietly in my account on the first of every month, and I quietly used it for utilities and groceries and the occasional prescription that my insurance didn't cover. I never asked for more. That wasn't the kind of woman I was. The first sign came the previous autumn, maybe 8 months before Mother's Day. Rich had left his laptop open on my kitchen table when he and Elena brought the grandchildren over for Thanksgiving. He'd stepped outside to take a call. A long call, the kind where a man walks to the far end of the yard and keeps his back to the house. I wasn't snooping, I was clearing plates. But I passed the table and I saw the screen. And what I saw was a wire transfer confirmation. The amount was $6,400. The recipient was listed as V. Moore. The memo line said, "November rent." I kept moving. I stacked the plates. I told myself it was a business arrangement. An employee, perhaps. A property he managed. Rich was in finance. There were 100 explanations. But I thought about it later that night, alone in my bedroom with the television on and the sound off. $6,400 for rent in Columbus. The second sign came in February. Elena called me on a Tuesday evening, which was unusual. We had a warm but structured relationship. Sunday dinners, school events, the occasional weekday text about the children. A Tuesday call meant something had shifted. She didn't say anything alarming. She said she was tired. She said Rich had been traveling more than usual. She said she sometimes felt like she was raising Marcus and Lily by herself, and then she laughed as if she'd said something embarrassing and changed the subject to Lily's piano recital. I listened. I said the right things. But when I hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a long time looking at the dark window above the sink. The third sign was a name, Vanessa. I heard it once, by accident, when I called Rich's cell on a Saturday morning, and he answered thinking he was declining the call. I heard him say, in a completely different voice than the one he used with me, softer, lower, a voice I didn't recognize as my son's. "Vanessa, I told you not to." And then the line went dead. He called back 4 minutes later and told me he'd been in a meeting on a Saturday. I said nothing. I wrote the name down on the notepad I keep by the telephone. And then came Mother's Day. Rich and Elena brought the children over for brunch. Elena had made a fruit salad and bought me a begonia for the porch. The children gave me drawings. It was a pleasant morning, the kind that photographs well. After lunch, when Elena took Lily to the bathroom and Marcus went outside to look at something on his phone, Rich sat down across from me at the kitchen table. He folded his hands. He smiled the smile he used in meetings. "Mom," he said, "I just want to make sure, are you happy with the $500 I send every month? Is it enough for what you need?" And I looked at my son. This man I had worked myself half to death to raise, this man with the Audi and the stone mailbox and the voice I no longer recognized. And I said nothing, because the night before, I had found a bank statement. It had come to my house by mistake. A misdirected piece of mail that should have gone to Rich's office address, but had somehow ended up in my mailbox. I had opened it without thinking, the way you open anything with your name adjacent to it, and I had seen the itemized outflows for March. There, in a monthly transfer column, in plain black ink, V. Moore, $80,000. $80,000. Every month. To the woman whose name I had written on my notepad. I looked at my son across my kitchen table with his folded hands and his meeting smile, and I said absolutely nothing, because I was deciding what to do with what I knew. They left around 3 o'clock. I stood on the porch and waved at the minivan until it turned the corner. And then I went inside and sat down at the kitchen table in the same chair Rich had sat in 2 hours earlier. The begonia Elena had brought was on the counter. The children's drawings were on the refrigerator. The fruit salad bowl was in the drying rack. I sat there for a long time. I want to be honest with you about what I felt, because it would be easy to describe this moment as purely righteous, a wronged woman sharpening her resolve. But that's not what it was. What it was, first and most powerfully, was grief. Richard was my son. I had held him when he had fevers. I had driven him to basketball practice in the dark on January mornings. I had attended his college graduation alone because there was no one else to sit beside me in the bleachers, and I had cried in the car afterward from pure pride. This man who was sending $80,000 a month to another woman while asking me if $500 was enough. He was also the boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder watching baseball. Those two things were both true at the same time, and that was the hardest part. But grief, I have learned, is not incompatible with clarity. And I was very clear. I was clear about what the bank statement meant. $80,000 a month was not a business expense. It was not a consulting fee or a property arrangement. It was a life, a full, maintained, comfortable life that Rich was funding in secret while his wife worked long shifts at a pediatric practice and came home to raise 2 children largely alone. While I lived on $500 a month and fixed my own gutters. I was clear about what was at stake. Elena did not know. I was certain of that. The woman who called me on a Tuesday evening to quietly admit she felt alone was not a woman who knew her husband was spending close to $1 million a year on someone else. She was a woman in the dark, and the dark was not kind to her. I was clear about what Rich would do if I simply confronted him. I had raised him. I knew how his mind worked when he was cornered. He would minimize, then explain, then apologize in a way that was really a negotiation. He would tell me it was complicated. He would tell me Elena had her own issues. He would tell me I didn't understand the pressures he was under. And if none of that worked, he would become cold. The board meeting cold. The folded hands cold. And he would find a way to make my access to my grandchildren contingent on my silence. Not overtly. Rich was never overt, but it would happen. so I did not confront him. What I did instead was go to my desk. I keep a 2-drawer filing cabinet in the back bedroom that Gerald bought in 1991, and I have never replaced. In it, I keep every document that matters. My will, the deed to the house, insurance policies, tax returns going back 15 years. I opened the top drawer and I found the misdirected envelope, which I had placed there the night before, under a folder labeled Utilities. I took it out and I read it again. Slowly this time, column by column. The account was in Rich's personal name, not the business. The March statement showed his regular income deposit, $240,000 from the firm, and the outflows. His mortgage, a car payment, what appeared to be a second car payment, and then the transfers. V. Moore received $80,000 on the 3rd of every month. There were also smaller transfers. Restaurant charges, what looked like travel expenses, a recurring charge to a jeweler in the Short North neighborhood of Columbus. I got out my yellow legal pad and I made a list. What I had: 1 bank statement, 1 month, misdirected mail. What I needed: pattern, documentation, timeline. What I could not do: tip Rich off before I had enough. The plan was not complicated. I did not want drama. I did not want a scene. What I wanted was for Elena to have the full truth, documented, undeniable, laid out clearly, so that she could make her own decisions with her eyes open. That was all. I wasn't trying to punish Rich, though I won't pretend the thought gave me no satisfaction. I was trying to make sure that a good woman didn't spend the next 10 years wondering why her life felt hollow and never knowing the real answer. I wrote down 3 steps. First, secure the document I already had. I drove the following morning to the UPS store on Morse Road and made 3 copies of the bank statement. I kept one at home, mailed one to my sister Carol in Cincinnati with a note that said, "Hold this for me, don't ask questions yet," and placed one in a sealed envelope in the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet. Second, find out more without exposing myself. I knew Rich's professional address and the name of his firm, Callahan Capital Advisors. I knew his assistant's name was a young man named Derek, who occasionally called me to confirm holiday plans. I was not going to call Derek, but I knew that Rich had, on 2 separate occasions over the past year, mentioned a property in German Village, a neighborhood of renovated brick row houses in the south part of Columbus, expensive and quiet. I had assumed it was a client property. I now had a different theory. Third, I needed a witness I could trust, someone who could be present when the moment came, because I had already decided there would be a moment, a specific, deliberate moment, and whose presence would prevent Rich from dismissing what happened as the confused act of a confused old woman. I thought about who that person might be, and then I did something I had not done in years. I called my neighbor Barbara Ostrowski, who was a retired paralegal, and I asked her if she wanted to have coffee the following Thursday. She said yes. I hung up and looked at the begonia on the counter. I was afraid. I want to be honest about that too. I was 71 years old, and I was preparing to do something that would permanently alter my relationship with my only child. And I did not know yet what the other side of that would look like. But I had looked at my son across that table, and I had remembered the question he asked me. $500 a month. "Are you happy with that, Mom?" And I picked up my legal pad and kept writing. The Thursday coffee with Barbara Ostrowski went for 2.5 hours. I had known Barbara for 11 years. She moved in next door after her husband passed, and we developed the kind of friendship that forms between 2 self-sufficient women of a certain age. Reliable, undemanding, built on a shared understanding that neither of us had the patience for pretense. She had spent 26 years as a paralegal for a family law firm in Westerville. She knew what a wire transfer record meant. She knew what a paper trail was for. I did not tell her everything at once. I told her enough. I told her I had come across financial information that I believed my daughter-in-law needed to see, and that I was trying to gather what was necessary before acting, and that when the time came, I would like her to be there. Barbara was quiet for a moment. Then she asked me one question. Is this about protecting Elena or punishing Rich? I thought about it genuinely. Both, I said, but mostly Elena. She nodded and refilled her coffee. Then let's do it right, she said. That conversation steadied me in a way I hadn't expected. There is something about being heard by another person, someone practical and calm, that converts private anxiety into something more manageable. I drove home feeling less like a frightened old woman and more like someone with a task. The following Saturday, I drove to German Village. I want to be clear about what I did and did not do. I did not hire a private investigator. I did not follow anyone or photograph anyone. What I did was drive to a neighborhood in my own city and park on a public street and read the addresses on the buildings. Columbus property records are public. I had spent 2 evenings on the county auditor's website, a site anyone can access from any computer, searching transfers and ownership under the name Moore. It took longer than I expected because I was searching broadly, but on the second evening, I found it. A property on Reinhard Avenue in German Village, purchased 14 months earlier, listed under the name Vanessa R. Moore. Purchase price, $410,000. Cash transaction, no mortgage. Cash. I sat in the car on Reinhard Avenue for about 10 minutes. The house was a renovated brick row house, narrow and deep, with a black front door and a small stone planter that held a rosemary topiary. It was a beautiful house, the kind of house you see in lifestyle magazines. Someone had chosen every detail carefully. I did not get out of the car. I drove home. The second bank statement arrived the following week, not misdirected this time, but forwarded. Rich's firm had apparently updated its mailing records partway through a billing cycle, and the April statement came to my address before the correction took effect. I will confess that when I saw the envelope, I felt, alongside everything else, a strange and irrational sense that the situation had its own momentum now, that the information was finding me, not the other way around. April looked identical to March. V. Moore, $80,000, third of the month. The jeweler charge was there again. There was also a new line, a hotel in Charleston, South Carolina, for 4 nights in early April. I checked my memory. Rich had told Elena he'd been in Charlotte for a client conference that week. I remembered because Elena had mentioned it on one of our calls. She said the children had had a stomach bug, and she'd been alone with them. Charlotte and Charleston, 2 different cities, 1 letter apart. I added the April statement to my file. I now had 2 months of documentation, a property record in Vanessa Moore's name, a cash purchase price, and a 14-month ownership timeline that aligned with the period during which Rich had become, according to Elena, increasingly absent. What I did not yet have was Vanessa Moore herself. Not as a person, not as a presence. I had a name, an address, a number on a page. Part of me preferred it that way. If she remained abstract, I could focus on what mattered. Elena, the moment I had been preparing for. It was during this period that Rich called me on a Wednesday afternoon, which was not unusual in itself, but the tone of the call was different. He asked how I was. He asked if I'd had any unusual mail lately, phrased casually, the way you'd ask about the weather. He said his firm had had some mailing issues, and he wanted to make sure nothing had ended up at my address by mistake. I told him nothing had come. I said it without hesitation, without a pause, in the same voice I used to tell him dinner was ready when he was 15. After I hung up, I sat very still for a moment. He knew something had been sent. He didn't know if I'd received it, and if I had, he didn't know whether I'd understood what I was looking at. He was testing me gently, the way he did everything. Not confrontation, probe first, then adjust. I had passed his test, but the clock had changed. I called Barbara that evening. "It needs to happen soon," I said. "He's starting to look around." "How soon?" she asked. I thought about Elena's schedule. I knew that she had Sundays off, and that she typically brought the children to visit me on the last Sunday of the month, sometimes with Rich, sometimes alone if he had work obligations. The last Sunday of May was 12 days away. 12 days, I said. Barbara said she would be available. I spent those 12 days doing only one additional thing. I organized. I placed the 2 bank statements in a clear plastic sleeve. I printed the property record from the county auditor's website. I wrote on a single sheet of paper, in plain language, the timeline. When the transfers began, how much, the Charleston Hotel, the property purchase. 1 page, no drama, just facts in chronological order. I put it all in a manila envelope and wrote nothing on the outside. And then I waited for the last Sunday of May. The last Sunday of May was warm, with the kind of Ohio sky that looks freshly painted. Pale blue, high clouds, the sort of morning that makes you feel briefly that everything might be all right. Elena arrived at 11 with Marcus and Lily. Rich was supposed to be at a brunch with a client and was not expected. That was what Elena told me when she called Friday to confirm. I had built the plan around that. Barbara was sitting in my kitchen when they pulled in, her coffee in front of her, dressed plainly. I had told Marcus and Lily she was my neighbor who stopped in occasionally. Children accept these things without question. I gave the children popsicles from the freezer and suggested they sit on the back porch. Lily had a book. Marcus had his phone. They were content. Elena and I sat at the kitchen table with Barbara. I placed the manila envelope on the table. I said, "Elena, I need to show you something. I need you to look at it before I say anything, and then you can ask me whatever you want." She looked at the envelope, then at me, then at Barbara. Her face went careful. That particular stillness that people develop when they have spent years half expecting bad news and have learned not to react before they know what kind it is. She opened the envelope. She read slowly. I watched her go through the bank statements, the property record, the timeline sheet I had written. She read the timeline twice. She did not cry. She did not say anything. When she finished, she set the papers down in a neat stack and placed her hands flat on the table on either side of them, as if she needed to feel the table's solidity. "How long have you had this?" she asked. "Since Mother's Day," I said. She nodded very slowly. That was the moment the back door opened and Rich walked in. He was still in his brunch clothes, a linen shirt, dark slacks, and he was holding his phone in his hand. He looked at the 3 of us, looked at the papers on the table, and I watched his face do something I had never seen it do before. It went for just a fraction of a second, completely blank. The meeting's smile was gone. The folded hands' composure was gone. There was nothing there, and then something else replaced it. A controlled, deliberate coldness. "Mom," he said, "what is this?" It wasn't a question. I said, "It's 2 months of your personal bank statements and a county property record. Elena is reading them. Those are private financial documents." His voice was very even. "I don't know how you came to have them, but this is not your business, and it's not appropriate." Barbara said quietly, "The statements were mailed to your mother's address. Public property records are available to anyone." Rich looked at Barbara as though he was noticing her for the first time and had not yet decided what she was. Then he looked back at me. "I'd like to speak to you alone," he said. "No," I said. Something shifted in his posture. He put the phone down on the counter and pulled out the chair across from Elena, the same chair he'd sat in on Mother's Day, and he sat down in it with a deliberateness that was almost theatrical. "Elena," he said, "whatever my mother has shown you, there is context here that she doesn't have. This isn't what it looks like." Elena looked at him. $80,000 a month, she said. Her voice was completely flat. "For 14 months. That's a business arrangement." "The property is in her name," Elena said. "I read the record." Rich looked at me, and in that look, I saw something I recognized as a kind of fury. Not explosive, not shouting, but the deep, pressurized kind. He picked up his phone and stepped away from the table and made a call. He spoke in a low voice for about 30 seconds, and then he ended the call and turned back. "I want those documents," he said to me. "I have copies," I said, "in more than one place." "You have no idea," he said slowly, "what you have just done to this family. You have no idea what the consequences of this are. I will not allow my children to be exposed to—" He stopped. He recalibrated. "You are not well, Mom. I think the isolation has affected your judgment. These documents are out of context. I intend to speak to an attorney about this." Barbara folded her hands on the table. "Dorothy found these documents in mail addressed to her home," she said. "She made copies through a commercial copy service, time-stamped. The property record is a public document available on the county auditor's website under Vanessa Moore's name. There's nothing in any of this that creates legal exposure for Dorothy." Rich stood up. "I need some time to think," he said. To Elena, "Don't do anything yet, please." Elena didn't answer. Rich left. We heard the car start in the driveway and then the sound of it backing out. Elena and I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that. The children were still on the back porch. Barbara made fresh coffee. Elena did not cry that afternoon, not in my kitchen. She was the kind of woman who cried privately, and I respected that. She asked me practical questions, the dates, the amounts, the timeline. I answered everything I could. Before she left, she hugged me for a long time in the doorway. "Thank you," she said. "I knew something. I didn't know what." After they left, I sat in the kitchen alone. I was 67 years old when I taught Rich to drive. I was sitting in that same passenger seat the day he ran the front tire over a curb and looked at me with pure panic, and I said, "It's just a curb. Keep going." I had not stopped thinking of him that way. Not fully. Not even now. I let myself feel that for a few days. I called no one. I tended the garden. I watched the evening news and went to bed early. I gave myself until Friday. Then I got up, made coffee, and kept going. Rich came on a Wednesday morning, 9 days after the Sunday. I heard his car in the driveway and recognized the engine before I saw it through the window. He came alone. No Elena. He was dressed casually, dark jeans, a simple gray shirt, which meant he had thought about what to wear. Rich in casual clothes meant Rich trying to reach the part of me that remembered him as a boy. He knocked, which he hadn't done in years. He usually just came in. I opened the door and let him in without saying anything. He sat at the kitchen table, the other chair this time, not the one across from me, and put both hands flat on the table, palms down, in a gesture that was either openness or performance. "I want to talk," he said. "Not argue, just talk." I poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down. He started slowly. He said he knew he had made serious mistakes. He used that word, mistakes, in the careful, bounded way that means I am acknowledging the category without accepting the full weight. He said Vanessa Moore was a situation he had let go too far and was in the process of ending. He said Elena knew the broad strokes now and they were talking. He said the children had not been affected. Then he said he had been thinking about me. He said he had been thinking about how small my house was, how the gutter still leaked, how I spent most of my time alone in a neighborhood that had gotten less safe over the past few years, and how that worried him. He had, he said, found a condominium in a development near Dublin, near him. 2 bedrooms, a proper kitchen, a patio garden with southern exposure. Maintenance included, he could transfer the deed to my name. He had also, he said, revised his thinking about the monthly support. 500 had been thoughtless of him. He was prepared to increase it significantly. And he had been talking to a travel agent. There was a garden tour of England in September that he thought I would love. He said all of this in the voice I remembered from when he wanted something, which had always been warmer than his regular voice. He was very good at it. And here is what I want to tell you honestly. I felt it. I am not made of stone. That was my son sitting across from me, offering me a garden with southern exposure. There was a part of me, the part that had driven him to basketball practice in the dark, the part that had cried alone in a parking lot at his graduation, that wanted to accept what he was offering and let the warmth of it cover everything else. That part of me was real, but I had spent 9 days tending my garden and watching the evening news, and I had done a lot of thinking in those 9 days. And what I had thought about most persistently was Elena's hands flat on the table on either side of those documents. The steadying of herself. The steadying of someone who had been trying to hold something together without knowing what was pulling it apart. You cannot unknow a thing. You cannot return to a condition of comfortable ignorance once someone has trusted you with the truth. I had stepped across that line 9 days ago, and the only direction was forward. Rich, I said, I love you. I have always loved you, and I always will. But no. He looked at me for a long time. Mom, he said quietly, think about what you're doing. Think about the grandchildren. If Elena and I... He stopped. Things fall apart when families go to war. Kids get pulled in 2 directions. Are you prepared to be responsible for that? That's not my responsibility, I said. That became your responsibility when you made the choice you made. He sat back. The warmth withdrew, not dramatically, but cleanly, like a blind being lowered. He nodded once. I'll give you time, he said. I don't need time, I said. I need you to be honest with your wife. He left without drinking his coffee. I sat for a while after he was gone. The condominium near Dublin had been a real thing. I could feel its shape in the room even after he left. The patio garden with southern exposure. I made myself think about Elena's hands on the table, and after a moment the shape went away. That afternoon I called Elena. I did not tell her about Rich's visit immediately. First I asked how she was doing. She said she was tired. She said she had an appointment the following week with a family attorney, a woman her colleague had recommended. She asked if I would be willing to speak to the attorney if it came to that, to confirm what I had found and how I had found it. Of course, I said. I also want you to know, Elena said, that I've told my sister Carol about this. She paused. My sister Carol, not your sister Carol. I know you have a sister Carol, which is a little strange. I surprised myself by laughing. It was the first time I had laughed in nearly 2 weeks. My sister Carol has the second copy of the bank statement, I said. It seemed appropriate. Elena was quiet for a moment, and then she laughed too. A short, tired, real laugh. After we hung up, I felt steadier than I had since Mother's Day. There was something in that brief exchange, 2 women laughing at a small absurdity in the middle of a hard thing, that made the ground feel more solid under me. I was not alone. Elena was not alone. The documents were in 3 places. Rich could observe all he liked. They came the following Saturday. I say they because Rich did not come alone this time. He brought his cousin Paul, who was 43 and worked in real estate and had always been, since they were teenagers together, the person Rich used as a bridge when he wanted to approach something indirectly. Paul had the kind of easy back porch manner that made people lower their defenses. He was a familiar face in my kitchen. He'd eaten hundreds of meals at this table. I offered them coffee. I said nothing to indicate that I was surprised. Paul started. He said he was there because he cared about the family. He said he had known Rich his whole life and knew this situation, like most situations, was more complicated than it looked from the outside. He said that Rich and Elena were already in counseling, which may or may not have been true, and that there was a real chance of the marriage surviving if things were handled within the family. He looked at me with the easy, warm expression he'd been wearing since 1987. "Dot," he said, "you know how these things go when lawyers get involved. It gets expensive, it gets ugly, and it's the kids who pay for it in the end. Marcus and Lily. Rich tells me you're very close to those kids." There it was, not a threat exactly, not something you could point to and say, that was a threat, just a door left open with a cold draft coming through it. "I am close to them," I said. "Then you understand," Paul said. "What Elena does with this information privately is one thing. But if this goes public, if it becomes part of a legal proceeding, that's not something that can be undone. Rich is their father. His reputation, his ability to provide for those children." "His ability to provide seems to be functioning adequately," I said. "He manages $80,000 a month for other commitments." Paul's easy expression tightened slightly. He looked at Rich. Rich set his coffee down. He stopped performing warmth. He leaned forward, and when he spoke, his voice was low and steady, and no longer resembled any version of my son I wanted to recognize. "Mom," he said, "you've spoken to Elena, and now Elena has an attorney. You have involved yourself in my marriage in a way that cannot be taken back. I need you to understand that there are things I can do in response to this. Elena's attorney will want you to testify. I will make sure that any testimony you give is scrutinized very carefully. I will raise the question of whether you are competent to accurately interpret financial documents. You are 71 years old. You live alone. You have been isolated." "I am not isolated," I said. "And I will have our family physician provide documentation of conversations we've had about your memory and your cognition." "We have never had such a conversation." "That will raise serious questions about your credibility as a witness. I am not threatening you." He paused. "I'm telling you how things will go if this continues." The kitchen was very quiet. I had thought about this possibility. Not this specific version of it, but the general shape of it, the discrediting. I want to be honest and tell you that my heart was beating faster than I would have liked. The mention of Marcus and Lily, said in that particular way, had gone somewhere deep and difficult. And the suggestion about my cognition, about my memory, hit something I couldn't entirely dismiss, because I am 71 years old, and I know what that age means, and I know what people think it means. And the idea of my credibility being publicly questioned was genuinely frightening. But I had learned something during those 9 days of rest in the garden. Fear that moves through you and out the other side is not the same as fear that stops you. I took a breath. "I've had coffee with Barbara Ostrowski 3 times in the past 2 weeks, I said. Barbara is a retired paralegal. She's been present for 2 conversations that I would characterize as relevant. She has her own notes." I paused. "She's also the person who suggested I keep a dated record of every communication I've had with you since Mother's Day. I've done that. I have it in my files." Paul put his cup down. "I think," I said, "that what you've described raising questions about a 71-year-old woman's mental competence in order to discredit her testimony about financial documents that were mailed to her home, is something a family court judge might also find relevant. Rich stood up. The coldness was complete now. He picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. "I'm not done with this conversation," he said. "I know," I said, "but I am." They left. I sat in the kitchen for 10 minutes without moving. My hands were steady, but something in my chest was shaking in a way that didn't show on the outside. I thought about Marcus and Lily. I thought about their father's voice saying the word competent. I thought about the cold draft through the open door. Then I thought about Elena's hands flat on the table. I went to my desk, opened the log I had been keeping, and wrote the date, the time, and everything that had been said. I noted the presence of Paul. I noted the specific language used. When I was done, I read it back once. Then I called Barbara. The meeting was held on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of June at the offices of Elena's attorney, a woman named Sandra Marsh, who operated a family law practice in a quiet building on High Street in Worthington. I arrived 15 minutes early with Barbara. We sat in the waiting area. I had brought the manila envelope. I had brought the log. Barbara had brought her own notes in a separate folder. Rich and his attorney arrived 5 minutes before the hour. The attorney was a man I'd never seen before, younger than I expected, with a careful suit and the kind of expression that is professionally neutral, but registers everything. Rich did not look at me when they came in. He looked at the wall. He had the tight, forward-facing posture of a man preparing to be extremely professional. Sandra Marsh was calm and organized. She had a conference table and a pitcher of water and a folder of her own. She thanked everyone for coming. She explained the purpose of the meeting, to establish the basis of Elena's legal position regarding marital assets and financial conduct during the marriage. She was not hostile in her manner, but she was very precise. She asked me to describe how I had come to possess the bank statements. I told her. Misdirected mail. My name adjacent on the envelope. Opened without awareness of the contents. Recognized Rich's account information. The second statement arrived during an administrative overlap in the mailing update. I had made copies, time-stamped through a commercial copy center. I provided the receipts from the UPS store. Rich's attorney, his name was Carl Briggs, I learned, noted that the original envelopes were addressed to Rich's business address and had been misdirected in error, and that Dorothy had opened mail not intended for her. Sandra Marsh asked me if my name appeared on the envelope. I said it did not appear specifically, but the street address was mine, and the outer label had been partially obscured, which was why the Postal Service had delivered it to my address. Barbara produced her notes from our conversations in early May. She had dated entries describing the substance of what I had shared with her and when, establishing that the documents had been in my possession and that I had been acting in good faith throughout. Carl Briggs made the competence argument. He was careful and measured about it. He said that Dorothy Callahan was a 71-year-old woman living alone, that she had misinterpreted financial documents without full business context, and that the interpretation she had placed on the transfers to V. Moore reflected a misunderstanding of her son's business arrangements. Sandra Marsh asked Carl Briggs if he could provide documentation of V. Moore's status as a business contractor or employee of Callahan Capital Advisors. He said that documentation was being prepared. Sandra Marsh said she would need it within 5 business days, and that in the meantime, she would be entering the property record into the file. The Reinhard Avenue property in German Village, purchased 14 months prior. Cash transaction, $410,000. Deed registered under Vanessa R. Moore's personal name. She set the document on the table. A personal residence, she said, purchased in cash, titled in an individual's name in a residential neighborhood, is not a standard business arrangement. Carl Briggs looked at the document. He looked at Rich. Rich said nothing. He was looking at the table now. Sandra Marsh moved to the hotel record. I had printed the confirmation from an email Elena had shared with me from a hotel in Charleston, South Carolina, for 4 nights in early April. She noted the dates corresponded with the period during which Rich had told Elena he was in Charlotte for a client conference. She noted the room had been billed to Rich's personal credit card, not the firm's corporate account. Charlotte and Charleston, Sandra Marsh said, in a tone that contained no sarcasm and required none. I may have, Rich started. Richard, Carl Briggs said quietly. Rich stopped. What happened next? I have thought about many times in the months since. Rich looked at Carl Briggs, then at Sandra Marsh, then across the table at Elena, who had been sitting with her hands in her lap for the entire hour, quiet and upright, watching. And something in Rich's careful composure fractured, not dramatically, not a scene, but a small, visible deterioration, like a seam opening. He made a sound that was not quite a word and put one hand briefly over his eyes. Carl Briggs requested a recess. During the recess, Barbara and I stood in the hallway near the elevator. Barbara said nothing, which was the right thing to do. After about 6 minutes, Rich and Carl Briggs came out of a side room, and Carl Briggs approached me, not Rich, Carl Briggs, and said that the question of Dorothy's competence would not be raised in these proceedings. I thanked him in the tone I used when I meant nothing by it. When we reconvened, Rich's position had changed entirely. He no longer contested the documents. He no longer contested the context. His attorney engaged with Sandra Marsh in the language of settlement parameters, which meant the argument was no longer about what was true. It was about what would happen next. Elena signed the beginning of a legal action at the end of the meeting. On the drive home, Barbara and I did not talk about what had happened in the room. We talked about her begonias, which were coming in well this year, and about a restaurant on Morse Road that she'd heard had a good breakfast menu. When I got home, I sat in the kitchen for a long time. The afternoon sun came through the window over the sink and lit up the table in a long rectangle. I thought, it is done now. The thing that needed to happen has happened. And then I thought, I need to fix the gutter. The divorce took 8 months. I will not tell you it was clean or simple, because nothing in family law is. There were motions and counter-motions and periods of weeks where nothing seemed to move, and then days where everything moved at once. Sandra Marsh was thorough. Carl Briggs negotiated. Rich and Elena spoke as little as possible through attorneys and email threads. I was a witness once briefly in a deposition conducted in Sandra Marsh's conference room. I described the envelopes. I described the dates. Barbara sat in the hallway outside and waited. The competence argument was not raised. The financial record that Sandra Marsh had constructed over those months was, in the end, the thing that settled the case. Rich did not contest most of it in the final stages. The 14 months of transfers to Vanessa Moore had been traced and documented, totaling approximately $1.1 million in direct transfers, with additional expenditures: the Charleston Hotel, jewelry, a ski trip in January I hadn't known about, charges at restaurants I'd never heard of. That brought the assessed figure considerably higher. Under Ohio's equitable distribution statute, marital waste is taken into account in the division of assets. Sandra Marsh knew her law. The settlement gave Elena the Dublin house or its full equity value. She chose the equity, sold the house within 60 days, and moved with Marcus and Lily to a neighborhood in Westerville she'd always liked, closer to her practice. She received a significant share of Rich's investment accounts. The children's college funds were untouched and placed in custodial accounts. Child and spousal support were calculated and fixed. Rich kept the firm. His income had not changed. I do not know what happened between Rich and Vanessa Moore after the proceedings began. I know that the Reinhard Avenue property was eventually listed for sale, and that I read about it on the county auditor's website one afternoon without having looked for it. I wrote nothing in my log about that. It felt like information that didn't belong to me anymore. Rich and I did not speak for the first 5 months after the meeting at Sandra Marsh's office. The silence was his. I did not pursue it. In November, about a month after the divorce was finalized, I received a card in the mail. No letter, no note. Just a card. One of those generic autumn scene cards from a pharmacy display. Rich had written inside it, "I know I was wrong. I don't know yet what I want to say about it. I'll call when I can." I put the card in my file drawer, in the same folder where I kept the log. He had not called by the time December came. I did not wait for the call or worry about it. I understood that there were some distances that could only be crossed at a person's own pace, and that I had done what I had done not for the purpose of a reconciliation, but for the purpose of the truth. If Rich found his way back across that distance one day, I would be here. If he didn't, that would be its own kind of answer. Elena brought the children to Thanksgiving dinner at my house that year. It was the four of us, Elena, Marcus, Lily, and me. And we ate at the kitchen table, and I made the pumpkin pie from Gerald's mother's recipe. Marcus, who had turned 15 and was going through the quiet period most 15-year-olds go through, helped me set the table without being asked. Lily told me about a book she was reading. Elena brought a bottle of wine, and we each had a glass with dinner, which we had never done before. After the children went to watch television in the living room, Elena and I sat at the kitchen table over the remains of the pie, and she said quietly, "I want you to know that you did the right thing." "I know," I said, which was true. "I also want you to know," she said, "that I spent a long time being angry at you too. In the early months. I know that doesn't make sense." "It makes complete sense," I said. "I'm the one who made it impossible to look away." She nodded. "That's exactly what it felt like." "I'm sorry for the hard months," I said. "I'm not sorry for showing you." She picked up her wine glass. "No," she said. "Neither am I." We sat together in my kitchen until the pie was gone, and the children had fallen asleep on the couch. I looked at the window over the sink, where the evening had gone fully dark. The gutter was fixed. I had hired a young man from the neighborhood in July, and he had done a thorough job for a fair price. The begonia Elena had given me on Mother's Day was still on the counter, still alive, which surprised me every week. The house felt quiet, but not empty. There is a difference. Empty is when the quiet has nothing in it. This quiet had Gerald in the walls and something new in the present tense. The knowledge that I had looked at something hard and not looked away from it. That was enough for me. That has always been enough for me. By the following spring, I had settled into a life that I would describe, without exaggeration, as good. I want to be careful about how I say that, because good is not the same as easy or the same as without grief. I had lost something over the previous year that I was still in the process of understanding. A version of my son that had lived partly in my imagination, simpler and more whole than the real one. Letting that version go is its own kind of mourning, and I did not rush it. But I had my garden, and it was a good spring for it. The tomatoes came in strong. The herbs along the south fence, Gerald's herbs technically, though I had tended them for 26 years, were lush in a way they hadn't been for several seasons. I bought a good pair of kneeling pads and spent 2 or 3 hours outside most mornings when the weather permitted. Barbara and I had breakfast at the restaurant on Morse Road most Thursdays. They had a good omelet and strong coffee, and the booth in the back was always available at 9:15. We talked about the neighborhood, about her begonias, about the books we were reading. We did not often talk about the previous year. It existed between us as context, not conversation. Elena had found her footing. She and the children were in Westerville now, in a brick Tudor with a backyard big enough for Lily to set up an easel and paint outside. Her practice had expanded. She'd taken on a second physician as a partner, which meant she could reduce her own hours slightly. She was sleeping better. She said that plainly, without additional context, on one of our Sunday calls. "I'm sleeping better." I understood the full weight of it. Marcus had turned 16 and was interested in architecture. He had begun drawing floor plans freehand, measuring rooms with a tape measure and reproducing them on graph paper. Elena showed me one over video call, and it was genuinely good. He had his grandfather's precision, which made me feel something I didn't have a word for. Lily was 12 and consuming books at a rate that required 2 library visits a week. She called me on Wednesdays sometimes and read me passages she wanted to share. We had developed a genuine literary friendship, the kind that exists between people who are 59 years apart and have found common ground anyway. Rich's life had contracted. I say this not with satisfaction, though I will not pretend to a purity of feeling that isn't there. 2 clients left the firm in the 6 months following the divorce item that appeared in a local business publication. A partnership discussion with a larger firm in Cincinnati went quiet. He retained the firm and his income, though at reduced volume. He was not ruined. Rich had built something real, and it did not collapse. But it was smaller and quieter, and I believe he felt that smallness as a constant awareness rather than a single event. He called me in March, 8 months after the card. The call lasted 22 minutes. He said he had been doing a lot of thinking. He said he understood that what I had done was, in some narrow and painful sense, the thing a mother does when she acts from love rather than loyalty. I said that was fair. I said I loved him and would continue to love him. We spoke again the following month and the month after that. Short, careful, honest calls. 2 people who had hurt each other in complicated ways, finding out whether there was something solid still underneath. I think there was. As for Vanessa Moore, the Reinhardt Avenue property sold in October. A young couple purchased it. The rosemary topiary in the planter was gone in the new listing photos. I do not know where she went or what became of the life that had been maintained so expensively and secretly. She had been a person in this story, too. What followed from her choices was hers to carry. I spent the first Sunday in May planting sweet peas along the back fence. Gerald had planted sweet peas the spring before he died, and I had not planted them since. I pressed the seeds into the soil one by one, tamped the earth down with my thumb, and thought about nothing in particular. The afternoon was warm. The gutter was doing fine. People ask me sometimes whether I regret it. I never do. Here is what I learned at 71 years old, in my kitchen with a misdirected envelope. Silence is not kindness. Silence, when it protects a lie, is just a different kind of harm wearing a quieter face. Every day I kept quiet. Elena went to work and felt the hollow of a life she didn't understand. The truth doesn't need your permission to be true, but it sometimes needs one person willing to carry it forward. What would you have done in my place? Leave a comment. I'd love to know. And thank you for listening.